Hello, I'm Craig Barton and welcome to this Tips for Teachers video. Now this video is actually a direct response to a previous Tips for Teachers video. I was lucky enough to interview the maths legend herself, Jo Morgan, and one of the tips Jo shared was don't forget the respond part of responsive teaching. And Jo's point was that there are two things we need to consider when we're doing a model of responsive teaching or assessment for learning. One is asking the question and collecting in the information from our students. But then the second part, which is just as important of course, is then responding to that information. Now, during my conversation with Jo, I outlined a strategy that I use with diagnostic questions to respond to different scenarios from the initial question. And I thought I'd just do a video on it just to flesh that out a little bit. So let's imagine that this is the diagnostic question that I've asked my students. Now you might want to just pause the video at this point and just familiarise yourself with this question. Okay, now I may have asked this question as part of a prerequisite knowledge check, or it may be a hinge point midway through the lesson when I'm deciding where I'm going to go next, or it may be an exit ticket at the end of the lesson when I'm thinking what do I need to do next lesson. Either way, let's consider three scenarios that could happen after I've asked this question. So the first is the overwhelming majority of students may get this question correct, voting with ABCD cards or mini whiteboards or however I choose to collect the information in. Now in this scenario, the way I respond is to quickly do a check of their reasons. So I may ask Matthew, I see you've chosen B, can you just explain why? The answer's B, and I'll just clarify if I need to Matthew's explanation, but then I'm going to move on. And the few students who've got this question wrong, they've heard the correct explanation and it's a small enough number that during the rest of the lesson I can just nip round and just have a quick conversation with them to check that they're happy and they understand. My cut-off point for this, by the way, is 80%. 80% and above getting it right, I can do a quick run through of the explanation and then crack on. Let's consider a second scenario and how I might respond. Now on the face of this looks like an absolute disaster. There is blanket lack of understanding. But actually in terms of a model of responsive teaching, this is quite obvious and easy how to respond because we need to revisit this concept. If this is prerequisite knowledge, I'm going to put my lesson on pause and I'm going to deal with this. If this is a hinge point question, we're certainly not moving on. We're going to slow things down, maybe backtrack. If this is an exit ticket, then this tells me that I need to revisit this at the start of the next lesson. And crucially, because I've used a diagnostic question, I've got some extra insight. I can see here that my students are split between D and A. So I can look at those options, those answers, and understand the misconception or misunderstanding behind them. But I think the most common scenario, and this is the most troublesome one, is something like this, where we have a split. We've got some students who've got this question correct and are ready to move on, but we've also got a group of students who are struggling on this and are not ready to move on. So what do we do in this scenario? Well, my focus as a teacher is going to be on the students who are struggling. I'm going to say to them, right, if you got this question wrong and you're struggling, what I want you to do is I want you to watch me on the board. And I'm either going to come up with another example or talk them through something. I'm going to support them. But what am I going to do with the students who've got this question correct? I don't want them sat around doing nothing. But at the same time, I don't want to have to think of another activity to give them and hand out another worksheet or something like that. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to ask them two of my favourite questions based around this diagnostic question. So I'm going to say, okay, if you're happy with this, you've got it right and you're happy with it, I want you to do one of these challenges. So I'll either ask them to do this. How would you convince someone who thinks the correct answer is A that their answer is not correct? Now do the same for C and D. So this is a real ramp up of challenge from just getting this question right, because now you've got to try and understand how somebody might get this wrong, but then try and convince them. So this is where students have to think perhaps of explanations or visual representations, arguments to communicate to somebody who's struggling with this question why they're wrong and how to think about it in a different way. That's a real challenge. Or I'll set my other favourite challenge, which is this. Change one thing in the question so that A is now the correct answer. Then do the same for C and D. So okay, B is the correct answer to this question, but how could you tweak this question so A's right? How could you tweak this question so C's right? And so on. Now what I like about these two prompts is they're generic. I can use them with any diagnostic question. I can only speak from my experience as mathematics, but I can't see any reason why those same questions couldn't be used for diagnostic questions in other subjects as well. And in terms of how I assess understanding of this, what I tend to do is get the students who are working on this just to swap with somebody else who's working on it. So if they're answering these on mini whiteboards, swap mini whiteboards and have a conversation and so on. So there's some strategies that I use with diagnostic questions to make sure I get the respond part of responsive teaching right. Was that any use to you at all? How might you use that tip? What would you need to change to make it work for you? If you did find that useful, I'd be super grateful if you could like the video and subscribe to the Tips for Teachers YouTube channel. Don't forget to visit tipsforteachers.co.uk for loads more tips like this. Thanks so much for watching.